Some people don't go quiet because they have nothing to say. They go quiet because the last time they said everything, it cost them more than they were willing to lose again. And if you're being honest, you already know that feeling. That moment where the words are right there in your chest, clear, sharp, ready. But something stops you. Not confusion. Not weakness. Something deeper. You've been in conversations where you could have explained yourself perfectly, but you didn't. Not because you couldn't, but because a part of you already knew how it would end. Misunderstood. Twisted. Minimized. And here's what most people don't realize. That silence you fall into. It's not empty. It's calculated. But we'll come back to that. Because from the outside, your silence looks simple. It looks like distance. Like you don't care. Like you've checked out. But that's not what's happening, is it? Inside, it's loud. Too loud. Thoughts replaying. Conversations rewinding. Every word you didn't say, echoing. And here's the part nobody tells you. People don't go quiet because they don't feel enough. They go quiet because they've felt too much, in places where it wasn't safe to. At some point, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't happen all at once. It was subtle. A moment where you explained how something hurt, and it got brushed off. A moment where you tried to be understood, and got corrected instead. A moment where you were honest. And it somehow turned against you. And maybe you told yourself it didn't matter. But your mind didn't forget. Because here's the truth. Every time you spoke and it led to confusion instead of clarity. Every time you opened up and it created tension instead of connection. Your system was learning something. Quietly. Slowly. It was learning that expression comes with a cost. And once that lesson settles in, you don't just decide to be quiet. You adapt. You start weighing every word before it leaves your mouth. You start calculating outcomes before the conversation even begins. And eventually, you realize something dangerous. Sometimes, saying nothing feels safer than being misunderstood. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Because most people look at someone who goes quiet and assume they've shut down emotionally. But the truth is, they've done the opposite. They've gone deeper. They've just taken everything inward. And what nobody sees, is how much is actually happening inside that silence. But before we go there, you need to understand something most people completely miss. Silence was never your first choice. No one is born believing their voice doesn't matter. That belief is built. Moment by moment. In small interactions that don't look important from the outside. But leave a lasting imprint on the inside. It starts when being honest doesn't lead to understanding. When expressing yourself doesn't lead to connection. Instead, it leads to resistance. You say how you feel, and suddenly you're too much. You explain your perspective, and suddenly you're wrong. You open up, and somehow you're the problem. And here's the part people underestimate. It's not the intensity of those moments that shapes you. It's the repetition. Because when the same outcome keeps happening, your mind stops asking, what should I say? And starts asking, is it even worth saying anything at all? That's the shift. And once that shift happens, silence stops feeling like suppression. It starts feeling like control. Like stability. Like the only way to protect what's left of your clarity. But what most people don't realize is, this isn't just a habit. It's a pattern. And patterns don't form without a reason. Over time, your system begins to recognize something most people never consciously notice. That being open doesn't always bring you closer to people. Sometimes, it pushes them away. And when that becomes your experience, even a few times, your brain doesn't take chances. It adjusts. Not out of fear. Out of intelligence. Because if speaking creates friction, and silence reduces it, then silence becomes the smarter option. At least, in the moment. And this is where people get it completely wrong about you. They think your silence means you don't care. But what they don't see is, you've already run the conversation in your head 10 different ways. You've already imagined every possible response, every misunderstanding, every outcome. And you chose silence. Not because you didn't have something to say, but because you already knew what saying it might cost. But here's the part that makes this even deeper. At some point, this stops being something you do, and it becomes something you are. There's a difference between stepping back for a moment and living in that distance permanently. And most people never notice when that line gets crossed. At first, you go quiet to regulate, to think, to avoid reacting in a way you might regret. That's healthy. That's control. But then something changes. You stop expecting to be understood. You stop hoping conversations will lead anywhere meaningful. You stop believing that explaining yourself will actually change anything. And without realizing it, you don't just withdraw from conflict. You withdraw from the possibility of being known. That's when silence shifts from a pause to a position. And once it becomes a position, everything changes. Because now, even when you have something to say, you don't feel the point in saying it. And here's what makes this even more complicated. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. But internally, everything is happening. So that's exactly what we're going to unpack next. Because the biggest misconception about quiet people is not that they feel nothing. It's that people have no idea how much they're actually holding inside. Because what most people never see is the noise inside someone who looks completely silent. It doesn't go away. It just moves inward. And this is where it becomes difficult to explain, unless you've lived it. You replay conversations long after they end. You think of better responses hours later, sometimes days later. You analyze tone, timing, wording, not because you want to overthink, but because something in you is trying to make sense of what went wrong. Or what could go wrong. And here's what nobody tells you. That inner dialogue, it never really stops. It builds. Quietly. Layer by layer. You have full conversations in your head that never make it into the room. You explain yourself perfectly, just not out loud. You understand your own emotions deeply, but translating that into words, in real time, with another person, feels risky. Not confusing. Risky. And that's the difference most people miss. Because speaking doesn't just require clarity. It requires safety. And when safety is uncertain, your system doesn't hesitate. It holds everything back. Not because you're avoiding, but because you're protecting. And here's where it gets even more misunderstood. People will tell you to just open up. As if it's that simple. As if silence is a bad habit you picked up randomly, instead of something your mind built carefully over time. But the truth is, what looks like stubbornness from the outside is structure on the inside. A structure designed to prevent something from happening again. And what is that something? That's the part most people never stop to question. Because it's not just about being hurt. It's about being hurt and misunderstood at the same time. There's a difference. Being hurt is painful. But being hurt and then having your reality questioned, twisted, or dismissed, that does something deeper. It makes you hesitate the next time you try to be seen. And eventually, you start doing something subtle. You stop giving people access to your full thoughts. You filter. You reduce. You simplify. Until what you say no longer fully represents what you feel. And over time, even that starts to feel unnecessary. So you say less. And less. and less, until silence becomes your default. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Because this isn't just emotional. It's biological. And most people have no idea. When psychologists talk about survival responses, most people think of two things: fight or flight. You either react or you escape. But there's a third response that almost nobody talks about. And if you've ever gone quiet when you were hurt, this might explain more than anything else. It's called freeze. But not in the way people imagine. This isn't about being scared in a dangerous situation. This is about your system detecting something it interprets as a threat, and deciding that neither fighting nor escaping will help. So it does something else. It shuts things down. Not completely. Just enough. Your body becomes still. Your energy pulls inward. Your voice slows or disappears. And here's the strange part. You still know exactly what you want to say. It's right there. Clear. But when you try to speak, it's like something blocks it. Your throat tightens. Your words lose momentum. Your mind hesitates, not because it's blank, but because it's protecting you. And this is where most people get it completely wrong. They think you're choosing not to speak. But in that moment, your system has already made the decision for you. Because from its perspective, staying quiet reduces risk. Risk of escalation. Risk of being misread. Risk of saying something that gets used against you later. And here's what makes this even more powerful. This response doesn't come from extreme danger. It often comes from repeated, subtle experiences. Conversations where you weren't heard. Moments where your emotions were minimized. Situations where being honest didn't make things better, it made things harder. And over time, your system connects communication itself with threat. So when silence shows up, it's not distance. It's regulation. But here's the part that almost nobody talks about. Silence protects you from conflict. But it also protects you from connection. And that's where the real tension begins. Because on one side, silence keeps you safe. No arguments. No misunderstandings. No emotional exposure. But on the other side, it keeps people out. Completely. They only see parts of you. Filtered versions. Edited responses. Never the full picture. And at first, that feels fine. Even better. Because being unseen is quieter than being misunderstood. It doesn't sting the same way. It doesn't create chaos. It just sits there, in the background. But over time, that quiet turns into something else. Something harder to ignore. And that's exactly what starts to surface. Because what begins as protection doesn't stay that way forever. Over time, that protection starts to change shape. At first, it feels like control. You avoid unnecessary tension. You don't waste energy explaining yourself. You stay composed, unaffected, distant in a way that feels clean. But here's what most people don't realize. That same silence that protects you from being misunderstood also prevents you from ever being fully understood. And that trade-off doesn't hit immediately. It builds. Quietly. Conversations stay surface level. People assume they know you, but they only know the version you allow them to see. You're present, but never fully there. And slowly, something starts to feel off. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just incomplete. Because there's a difference between being alone and feeling unseen. And what nobody tells you is, you can be surrounded by people and still feel like no one actually knows you. Not because they don't care, but because you stopped giving them access. And here's the paradox. You didn't do that to disconnect. You did it to protect yourself. But the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Because silence isn't just an action anymore. It's a pattern. And patterns, when repeated long enough, start to feel like identity. You begin to believe, this is just how I am. Quiet. Reserved. Hard to read. But that's not where it started. That's where it settled. And this is where things get even more confusing, especially for the people around you. Because from their perspective, your behavior doesn't always make sense. One day, you're open, engaged, present in a way that feels real. The next, you're distant, unreachable, almost like you disappeared without explanation. And to them, it feels inconsistent, unpredictable. But here's what they don't see. There's nothing random about it. It's not moodiness. It's capacity. Because being open, for you, isn't neutral. It costs something. Every conversation where you show up fully. Every moment where you let your guard down. Your system is working harder than people realize. Processing. Monitoring. Adjusting. And after a while, it reaches a limit. Not because something went wrong, but because staying open for too long feels unsafe. So what happens? You pull back. Not to punish. Not to send a message. But to recover. To regulate. To return to a state that feels manageable again. And without understanding that, people misread you. They think your silence is intentional distance. That your withdrawal means disinterest. But the truth is, your openness wasn't an act. And your silence isn't a rejection. It's a rhythm. A constant shift between connection and protection. And if that rhythm is ignored, or misunderstood, it only reinforces the very thing that created it. You go quieter. More contained. More careful. Because every misinterpretation feels like proof that speaking isn't worth it. And this is where the cost becomes harder to ignore. Because what started as self-protection, slowly becomes self-limitation. Not all at once. But in small, almost invisible ways. You stop sharing certain thoughts. You avoid certain conversations. You hold back in moments where you could have been seen. And over time, you begin carrying everything alone. Entire emotional experiences, processed internally, with no outlet. And that creates pressure. Not explosive pressure. Compressed pressure. The kind that builds silently. Because when nothing leaves, everything stays. And eventually, that internal world becomes heavier than it was ever meant to be. But here's the part that makes this even more difficult. The longer you stay in that pattern, the harder it becomes to step out of it. Not because you don't want to, but because it starts to feel unfamiliar. Expression feels risky. Vulnerability feels unnatural. Even when you're around people who might actually understand you. Your system doesn't immediately trust it. Because it's not responding to the present. It's responding to what it learned in the past. And that's what keeps the pattern in place. Not your personality. Not your preference. But your memory. And what most people don't realize is, survival patterns don't disappear just because the environment changes. They stay until something gives your system a reason to update. And that brings us to something most people approach the wrong way. Healing. Because if you've learned to survive through silence, the solution is not to suddenly force yourself to speak more. That doesn't work. In fact, it usually makes things worse. Because now you're recreating the same pressure that made silence necessary in the first place. So the question isn't, how do I stop being quiet? The real question is, what would need to feel different? for silence to no longer feel necessary. And that's where everything begins to shift. But not in the way most people expect. Because the answer isn't in forcing expression. It's in changing what expression leads to. And here's what most people get wrong about healing this pattern. They think it starts with you becoming more open, more talkative, more emotionally available. But that's not where it begins. It begins with safety. Real safety. Not the kind people claim to offer, but the kind your system can actually feel. And that kind of safety is specific. It's being listened to, without being corrected mid-sentence. It's being asked questions, without hidden judgment behind them. It's having space, where your words aren't rushed, reframed, or quietly dismissed. But here's the part nobody explains clearly. Your system doesn't trust safety just because it appears once. It watches. It waits. It tests. Because from its perspective, one good moment doesn't erase a pattern. So even when you find yourself in a different environment, with different people, you might still go quiet. Not because they've done something wrong, but because your system hasn't updated yet. And that can be confusing. You might wonder, why am I still like this, even when things feel okay? But here's the truth. You're not reacting to what's happening now. You're reacting to what happened consistently before. And until your system experiences something different, repeatedly, it won't take the risk. So healing doesn't look like suddenly becoming expressive. It looks like something much quieter, much slower. You begin to notice your silence. Not judge it. Not fight it. Just notice it. You start to recognize the difference between, I don't want to speak right now, and I'm afraid to. And that awareness changes something. Because for the first time, silence isn't automatic. It's observed. And once something is observed, it can shift. Not all at once, but gradually. You start choosing small moments. Low-risk moments. Moments where saying a little feels possible. Not everything. Just enough. And when those moments are met with care, something subtle happens. Your system begins to update. It realizes expression doesn't always lead to damage. Being seen doesn't always lead to distortion. And that's how the pattern begins to loosen. Not through force, but through new evidence. Because what created the silence wasn't a single moment. It was repetition. And what softens it is also repetition. But this time, in the opposite direction. And here's the shift that matters most. Silence stops being your only option. It becomes one of many. You can still choose it, but you're no longer trapped inside it. And that's the difference. Because the goal was never to remove your silence. It was to give you the freedom to decide when it's necessary, and when it's not. But before that fully settles in, there's something you need to hear. Especially if parts of this felt uncomfortably familiar. You're not broken. You didn't miss something everyone else figured out. You adapted. In an environment where being open had consequences, you found a way to protect yourself. And that matters. Because what looks like distance now is often the result of intelligence under pressure. A system that learned, quickly and effectively, how to avoid being hurt in the same way twice. And survival like that is never a flaw, even if it becomes limiting later. But here's where everything comes full circle. You were never meant to stay there. That version of you, the one that learned to hold everything in, was built for a specific environment. Not for every environment. And the moment that environment changes, even slightly, there's an opportunity. Not to become someone else, but to reclaim parts of yourself you had to set aside. Your voice, your clarity, your ability to be understood without fear. And that doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments. Moments where you're heard and not interrupted. Moments where your words land and aren't twisted. Moments where silence is respected but not required. That's where things begin to shift. Quietly, naturally, without force. And if you've made it this far, there's a reason. Because something in this didn't just make sense. It felt familiar. Maybe a little too familiar. And if that's the case, then this isn't just information for you. It's recognition. And that matters more than most people realize. Because change doesn't start with action. It starts with being seen. Even if it's just by a voice, through a screen. So if this gave you even a small sense of clarity, or helped you understand something about yourself you couldn't quite explain before, stay with this. That's what this space is for. On this channel, we don't just talk about what's obvious. We explore the patterns most people overlook. The quiet behaviors. The internal shifts. The things that don't get said, but shape everything. So if that's something you want more of, you already know what to do. And if any part of this felt like your story, you don't have to explain everything. You don't have to justify it. Even one sentence is enough. Not to be fixed. Not to be analyzed. Just to be seen. Because sometimes, connection doesn't begin with saying everything. Sometimes, it begins with realizing you were never the only one who learned to go quiet just to survive.